My name is Jeff Chandler. Your moderator for this evening's lecture. I'll first like to introduce Professor Carrington. Professor Carrington is a Barbadian, a Harrison College graduate. He graduated with a BSc in Biological Sciences, Honours Botany from the University of Edinburgh. I followed this with a doctoral research in plant physiology at the University of York, UK. He enjoyed a long career on the academic staff of the University of the West Indies, Cayfield campus, becoming professor of plant biology in 2002. He served in various administrative roles at the university, including dean of the science faculty. His research has focused on the biochemistry of fruit ripening, as well as the flora of the Eastern Caribbean. Aside from his scientific and technical papers, he authored early editions of this book, of the book Native Plants of Barbados and Wild Plants of the Eastern Caribbean, and was editor and lead author of A to Z of Barbadian Heritage. His outline pictorial database, Plants of the Eastern Caribbean, has been used by many. He was made Professor Emeritus of Plant Biology of the university on his retirement in 2021. And as you can see, this is 2026, he's still giving, still working, still doing stuff. So without any further ado, we will have him present on native landscapes, beautification using native flora. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I presume everybody can hear us all right. I'm not sure if it's possible for you to do anything, but if there's a problem, maybe do whatever you can do, raise your hand or something on your Zoom if you have that option. Okay, so basically, this is my topic as Jeff introduced me. Jeff and I go back a long way. We work together, and we still continue to work together, as he certainly is a very much more practical person than I am, so I often have to pick his brains. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about a little bit is about the flora of the Caribbean in a very kind of brief way. And then we're going to look at where these native plants are found in Barbados, the kind of plant communities, and the importance of trying to conserve these various plant communities to keep them from disappearing altogether. And then we're going to shift gears to really the main topic of the lecture, which is about gardening with native plants. Why, what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And obviously, I'm going to give some examples. Obviously, I could give a lot, but, there's only so much time. So without further ado, that's my basic outline, and I'll get going now. So the Caribbean islands are what is called a biodiversity hotspot. That means that we have a lot of diverse ecosystems. We have a lot of special, unique species, and we have a lot of threats, both from, development, human threats, as well as natural hazards like hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes, depending where you live. And of those, say, 13,000 species of plants, flowering plants, half of those are unique or endemic, as we call it, to the Caribbean region. So it's a very important thing to recognize. And just so we're speaking the same language, I'm just going to explain a few terms I'm going to use so we're all on board understanding each other. So when I say native species, I mean that these plants occur naturally in an area. So for example, native to tropical America means the American tropics, which includes the Caribbean, but also South America and Central America. It means these are plants that got here on their own accord. Humans did not introduce these plants. And then a kind of subset or subsection of native plants are what we call endemic plants or endemic species. And they're unique to one area or place. So for example, if you have a plant that is only found in Barbados and nowhere else in the world, we would say it is endemic to Barbados. But then we could have some which are endemic to the Eastern Caribbean or the Les Antilles. So it may be on all the islands of the Les Antilles, including Barbados, and we could say that they're endemic, that plant is endemic to the Eastern Caribbean. So those are two terms that you may hear me use. And then the other term that you're going to hear as well is exotic. Now, exotic in terms of plant species doesn't mean something looking fantastic, unusual, like something you would see at Kadooman. No, exotic just means that it's introduced. It's not naturally here. Humans brought it here. So one group of exotic plants are those which we say are naturalized. So some things were introduced here and then were able to reproduce on their own, spread on their own, become established. So when we say a naturalized species, we mean it's not native, it came from outside, but now it's like part of our flora. So they're doing its own thing. And then we have the extreme example of that is invasive species. So these are exotic species which are like taking over the island. They're displacing the plant that should be there in that forest or that beach or whatever. Okay, so those are some terms that I'm going to use just to get them out of the way. So here is a picture I took on St. Eustatius. Now, Coralita is an invasive species there. Now, it's an invasive species in Barbados too, but it's nothing like that in St. Eustatius. 3% of the land area is covered in Coralita and Typogon leptopus. This is a vine with pink flowers. I think most of you know. So we're always concerned about invasive species because they can just, take over a landscape, like in the case of St. Eustatius. In Barbados, it's bad enough, but it's not that bad. So to give you some numbers, the number of flowering plants we have in Barbados in the wild is around 650. And then 2 of these are unique to Barbados, found nowhere else in the world. The Lesser Antilles, which is the island chain, from Grenada up to whatever, the most northern island, Anguilla maybe, I'm not sure. That's like, like 2,500, just over that number of plants, species. And 10% of them are endemic to the Lesser Antilles. So unlike Barbados, we're only at 0.3%, 2 plants of the 650. We have quite a few plants which are endemic to the Lesser Antilles. And some of them may be in Barbados too. So in other words, because Barbados is part of the Lesser Antilles, you could have some of them here as well. Anyway, the main point is if you look at the bigger, older islands of the Caribbean, like Jamaica and Cuba, you'll see there are a lot more species and a lot more endemics or unique plants. Half the flora of Cuba is unique or endemic to Cuba, found nowhere else in the world. Just over a quarter of the flora of Jamaica is found nowhere else in the world. Okay? So these are the 2 Barbados endemics. The one on the left is Phyllanthus andersonii, and the common name I think is broom. It's a shrub. You find it in gullies, and it's quite common. The one on the right is a little vine that you find in dry cliff areas. In fact, the last time I collected it for the herbarium, it was below the cliff at the university, under there, that dry woodland, dry forest. I hate to say that we were looking for that plant recently and we couldn't find it. Now, I think plants are very resilient, so I don't think it's lost. But it just goes to show you, you can kind of become, a bit laid back and think, oh, it's there, it's not a problem. And then when you try looking for this plant, which is not found nowhere else in the world, you find, hey, I can't find this thing. So once we get a bit of rain and give this plant a chance to kind of come back a bit, we're going to find it without any doubt. Famous last words. I would hate to think we've lost it. So we talked about lesser Antillean endemics, and here we have two examples. So the plant we call the maypole, Agave carato, is found in other islands of the Lesser Antilles, but that particular agave is not found anywhere else in the world except the Lesser Antilles. But it's also in Barbados. So it's not a Barbados endemic because it's not unique to Barbados, but it's unique to the Lesser Antilles and including Barbados in that distribution. And then the macaw palm is another example of a Lesser Antillean endemic. This is the spiny palm you find in gullies. Now, be careful because not everything that has a Barbados name, especially common names, is from Barbados. So the Barbados cherry is not from Barbados. It is from Central America. It was introduced here. It's not an endemic Barbados plant or even an endemic Caribbean plant. It comes from, as I said, a little further south and west. Likewise, the Pride of Barbados is not from Barbados either. That also, I believe, is South American, although there's some controversy about that. So just because somebody's called some plant is called Barbados X, Y, and Z, it does not mean that it is from Barbados. All right, so if I'm going to talk with native plants, I really need to set the scene to show you the kind of ecosystems, the kind of plant communities that these plants are found in. Because if you are a gardener, you will know that the most important thing is to find the right spot for a plant. So if your garden is on a cliff in St. Philip, you really need to be looking for native plants that would normally be in that kind of habitat. You're not going to go to some wet, moist gully and take some plant out of the shade and stick it in the hot sun on a cliff in St. Philip. So let's have a look at our basic ecosystems and their relative. We'll talk a bit about their importance. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about coastal plant communities. And I'll talk about dunes first. The dunes. Really, dunes are just formed on windy beaches. If you have wind, like on the East Coast, it's gonna, on the beach, you have plants growing, and they are gonna trap sand, and in so doing, create a dune. So these dunes you see here are, this is at Belle Plaine, and basically, they protect that area. If we have some serious storm surge, those dunes are going to stop water from ending up in Belle Plaine. And you can see on the right, there are some students of mine some days back, years back, up on the top of one of those dunes. They're quite high. To us to achieve that kind of protection by engineering would be a major task, an expensive task. So give the plants their due. They're actually doing something that is useful for us. Okay, beach vegetation. So I walk on this Carlisle Bay beach every morning, not every morning, 5 mornings a week or whatever. And I just want to show you the importance of beach vegetation. So here to the left of that slide, you can see, there's some sea gray, there's some trees, and there's some houses from years back still there. This is a recent building, and that suffered a lot of loss of basically, there's no vegetation there. The vegetation being cleared, the beach vegetation, I guess they plan to plant all kinds of fancy things. And that beach vegetation, which you can still see further along, would have helped protect when we had that storm surge some weeks back. So I want to emphasize about beach vegetation. It's really important to protect the vegetation on the beach, especially with climate change, with sea level rises, predicted to be whatever by 2050 or something. We really have to ensure that we protect what is growing on the beach and just don't take it for granted, because when you know how to try to protect the buildings that you have by having removed the vegetation, it's going to cost you a lot of money to do this by an engineering approach rather than just taking a natural, nature-based approach of letting the plants kind of hold the land for you. Okay, my second then kind of community, we move from a beach, is wetlands. So wetlands are where we have, standing water for most of the year, if not all the year. This is down the East Coast. I think this is Green Pond. A lot of this is kind of herbaceous wetland, what we call a marsh. But then we have mangroves, like on the South Coast at Graham Hall. And this is the white mangrove section of that. Again, a very important community with, hosting all kinds of animals, especially birds. Going back to the coast again, we're still on the coast. We have what we call sea rock vegetation, or rock pavement, to use the kind of technical term, where the cliffs have little shallows with soil collecting and plants start to grow there. And in fact, that's how Barbados started, because Barbados was pushed out of the sea, as a small coral island growing on a kind of hummock on the seabed. And basically by plants managing to survive there, landing there, rotting there, their bodies becoming compost and part of the soil, and the rocks weathering. That's how we got the soil we have after whatever it is, 600,000 years. Now, another kind of plant community along the coast is what we call scrub. So scrub is really like shrubs, shrub-based, not really trees. We are tree, but mainly shrubs. And this is what we would find again down the East Coast with columnar cactus, and actually quite a few prickly plants to kind of stop animals from eating them. Unfortunately, the role of a plant is to be eaten by animals. So if that's what you're there on Earth to do, then you've got to try and dissuade animals from eating you. And one way is by being all kind of prickly. Coastal or littoral forest. So we have these trees now which are quite salt tolerant. Growing, say, this is near Bath, Skeets Bay, Chub Bay. And the wind, bevels the level of the trees. And only certain trees can survive, and shrubs, in that kind of ecosystem. And then we have dry forest. Now I have to confess, this picture was taken in Martinique, because dry forest is like further back from the sea. Well, we've managed to convert all of that into some kind of development on certainly most of the island. We hardly have any dry forest like that standing. And that picture was taken in like January, where a lot of those trees are preparing to shed their leaves for the dry season. Those yellow patches you see in that dry forest are basically birch gum trees. And I'm going to mention birch gum later on in my talk. And then going further inland now in Barbados, in the cracks in the coral, the so-called gullies, we end up with a very moist forest. And this is some days when we had taken students out, and you can see the height of the vegetation. It's very humid, it's very wet, and it's like 2 tiers of trees. So this is also, a different kind of plant community. Now, this one here is also related to the last one. This is a moist forest, and this is Turnasol Wood in St. Andrew. And this is the last, it's the original, supposedly original forest. It was never cleared. So not that the whole island was forested like this, but this kind of moist forest, this is a remnant of what was here when Europeans arrived here to settle the island in 1627. Now, one of the sad commentaries is that we have no terrestrial protected areas by law, gazetted. In other words, there's policy, obviously, not to go and cut down Turnasol wood, but it needs to be by law an area which is protected with certain rules, and even certain gullies, the same thing. We have a protected marine area at Folkestone, but as yet, we haven't managed to do that on land. But I think that's all changing after years of people talking about it. We have some projects going which are going to go to the direction of seeing Turnasol wood protected. Okay, now if we were a mountainous volcanic island, we would have rainforests. But I want to stress we do not have rainforests, okay? You have to have, you have to be high enough up on a mountain such that the plants don't feel any dry season. In other words, there's always an excess of rain over evaporation, evapotranspiration, transpiration by the plant. We don't have enough height for that kind of community of three strata of trees to develop. So Turnstile Wood is not a rainforest, and there's no rainforest in Barbados, despite what you may read on some tourist brochure. So some years ago, I did a project with two colleagues at the Smithsonian, and we looked at those 263 species of Lesser Antillean endemics, and it turned out like 70% of them were actually threatened in some way or another. So we can't sit back and think, oh, these are fine. These are plants that are found nowhere else in the world except the Lesser Antilles, and the majority of them are threatened in some way or other. So, be aware. Let me show you some examples of that. So this is a picture taken in the Cayman Islands. And this is coastal forest, coastal woodland. And there's a palm there, this fan palm, Coccothridax. We have a different species of Coccothridax. This is their special one. This tree is the birch gum. Nowadays, sometimes called the tourist tree because it peels like someone who's been in the sun for a long time. Looks nice. That's what happens to that. Not just here. Somebody decides to develop that area. They leave a couple of trees that, they think are desirable, and whoosh, that's gone. Coming back home, that same coastal scrub we talked about down on the East Coast, that used to be, subject to an area of sand mining. And this poor clump of cactus, how many ever years old? I know my colleague Jeff Chandler, who's a cactus man, is probably crying right now when he sees the cactus. Well, we've now, I think, kind of cut back on that sand mining, but a lot of that coastal scrub has been lost on the East Coast. Not just there, but even, further back, not just in the sand mining area. So we come along the coast here, nice East Coast walk where the train used to run. And you can see why people might want to wake up to that view on a morning. So some of us will remember the condominium, as we call it, when there are condominiums going up everywhere along the coast of Barbados. That seems to have kind of had its day. But the point is, we have to be vigilant. We want to preserve some of that unspoiled natural vegetation and the plants that are on it for future generations. We've enjoyed it. We just can't convert the whole island into some kind of, tourism development project. So native plants and natural vegetation are under threat. That is the bottom line of what I'm saying. Those various categories we talked about, there's certain areas where we'll find good examples of that which have not been impacted. And we have to make sure that we maintain them, stop anyone from kind of destroying them. Okay, so we're going to change gears a bit. Having set the scene of where these plants are, we're going to talk about how we might use some of these native plants in landscaping and so forth. So I want to introduce a topic here, sustainable gardening, which is really saying you're going to garden in such a way that you are not really, having many inputs, using much energy, wasting water. You are basically doing gardening in a way that the earth is not suffering as a result of your activities. So by that, I'm saying we want to conserve water in our garden. We want to reduce the energy we use. We want to compost the waste and put it back in the garden. We want to select plants which are suitable. And that's where the native plants come in. I'm not saying you can't have exotic plants, but I'm saying we need to use native plants as well. We also have to have a garden design that basically is environmentally friendly. So you don't necessarily want a huge big area of lawn that you're cutting every week in the rainy season, and then cutting with a lawnmower, with gas, all that kind of thing. You want low maintenance, a garden where you really not having to do much in terms of spraying with things or using energy or using water. And part of that is zoning. So what I'm saying here is you might have a small area where you have these really water demanding plants that you like, you want to show off, which are usually exotics, which are not, which need to probably be in some shade and watering every day. That's going to be like a minimal part of your garden, hopefully. And then most of your garden is going to be in plants which are able to survive this dry season without you having to be watering them every day or every week or whatever. So that's just an idea. Think about not a garden that is, a whole bunch of a mass of color demanding water, but certain areas demanding, different levels of input. Now, one of the problems we have about native plants, although Jeff mentioned my book, which we'll mention at the end, is that we don't really have a list of what are good native plants for the Caribbean to grow in gardens. Like in Florida, you can look at some of their ideas from their books. And in their case, it's reached a stage where they have developed so much of their land that some of these plants can only now survive in gardens. They've disappeared from the wild. Now, we're not at that stage yet. I'm not suggesting we need to uproot plants that are growing happily in a gully and stick them in your garden to save them. But I'm just saying other parts of the world have reached that stage where, they've developed so much of their land that there's really no room for native plants. So what is our concept of a garden? Traditionally, it's what we like, what serves us, and how it looks, the aesthetics. But now we have to add other things. We want to have low water use, low chemical inputs, wildlife habitat. By that, I'm not necessarily saying monkeys, because monkeys are invasive. I'm more talking about all the birds and all the insects and all the various animals, the fauna that has been here on this island for the 100,000 odd years or hundreds of thousands of years that the island has been here, and have evolved with the plants. They are adapted to the plants, and likewise elsewhere in the Caribbean. And then a garden that really plays some role in conserving this biological diversity, whether we talk about the plants or the animals. Okay, so native plants, as I said, because they've been here a long time, they are relatively well adapted to our habitat. Having said that, as I said, you have to choose your habitat well. If you have a house in St. Thomas where the rain falls every day, there are plants that you can grow which are native with no help from you really, just the natural rain. Well, if you're living, in coastal Christchurch or St. Philip, you're gonna have to use different plants which are adapted to those more dry ecosystems that I showed you earlier along the coast. The native plants are going to support the local fauna, that is to say, the animals. The native plants are also part of our traditional landscape and part of our culture. We don't tend to stress that, but there's a lot of linkage between culture and plants. The names we use for plants are, a lot of that is tied up in our culture. All right, well adapted then. No irrigation, no fertilizer, pesticides. Many native trees are hurricane resistant. I want to touch on that briefly too. So here we have a nice book from Florida, Stormscaping. And this is largely written, I think, as a result of Hurricane Andrew. I can't remember when Hurricane Andrew decimated Florida, but as a result of that, this lady wrote this book. And one thing she said is that the natives seem to be more hurricane resistant in terms of the trees. So like only a third of exotic trees were still standing. whereas 2/3 of native trees were still standing. So that's a big difference. All right. So if you have all these kind of fancy exotic trees that you're probably enjoying that nobody else has, it may well be the first thing to fall when we do finally get a real hurricane. The first one proper since Janet. So what's the worst affected tree in Florida? I want you to guess. I didn't really guess. Think about it. I'll show you the picture, but I have to say the picture isn't very easy to recognize the plant from. It's Casuarina. Casuarina fall like pins, 9 pins. That was the worst affected tree in Florida. So be warned. Don't go planting a Casuarina, which is an Australian tree anyway. You know, it was planted here because it's very high calorific value. It burns well, but you know, and it can grow where other things won't grow. But it's definitely not your first choice for a tree to plant. All right, here's my garden after. I can't remember the name of this either, but this was a serious storm that passed us maybe 20 years ago. Maybe somebody can remember what I'm talking about. But these are the roots of that tree just by the main road here. The tree was part of India, Peltiforum pterocarpum, a tree again from out in Asia. Now, a lot of leguminous trees are nitrogen fixing, which means they have to be very shallow rooted, and therefore they topple very easily in high wind. And I remember speaking to somebody dealing with these trees that had fallen, and he said most of the trees he had to deal with were this pride of India. So that was there by my house. I had to find a place, a gully that would accept this trunk. I had to pay to have it moved. It was misery. So you don't want to have that. But what I will say, and it may surprise you, because you know there are a lot of Bajans who just want like their yard concreted around, no vegetation in sight. But vegetation can actually protect buildings. And I'm not saying you don't have to trim the trees. I'm not saying the tree should not be at some distance from the building. You don't want it right next to your house. But the truth is, the vegetation can absorb some of the wind energy. And then this is the same book I showed you. This lady, obviously these are not the same house design. So I mean, it's not a perfect experiment. But on this same street, the house on the left got very badly damaged, and the one on the right that had all these trees and hedges up front hardly had any damage. Now, as I said, as a scientist, it's not a perfect experiment. But we don't tend to think of that these trees, as they're shaking around, are actually taking some of that energy that may be used to lift off your roof. So again, think about trees and vegetation around your house a little differently. Although I agree, keep it trimmed to a degree and don't plant trees too near to your house. Okay, the other point I made was that native plants support local fauna. So this is not necessarily our local fauna. I couldn't find a good image. That looks like a lion there, but anyway, what I'm saying then is that you know there are insects and birds and things like that that are going to be pollinating our plants, that are going to be spreading the seeds, all these things, and then helping decompose some of these plants and leaves, or their leaves when they fall. So it's what we call a food web. And the exotic plants may not be so good at that. They may not be so good at dealing with the insect. They may not be able to be pollinated by the insects we have here. The birds may not be able to spread its fruit and so forth. I talked about cultural identity. Now, this is a painting by the late Alison Chapman Andrews. Chapman's Gully, it says. And basically, I don't think that could be anywhere else in the Caribbean. The cabbage palms, they look somewhere out in the Scotland district as well. Don't know where Chapman's Gully is, but anyway, the point I'm trying to say is that we are affected by our vegetation. I always say too, when I go to other islands, I went to other islands, you know, you go to these volcanic islands and you look up and see the mountains and the trees, it has an effect on your personality, I think. So the Barbadian psyche, I think, has been molded by this vegetation around us. We may not like to think so, but it has. And also the fact we can't see any other island, unlike every other island where you can see another island. And that's another story. So going back now to that nice coastal walk where the train used to run, somewhere down St. John by Glen Burnie. This really looks nice to me. And I'm going to talk about some of these plants you're seeing here in this scrub vegetation. So if you're saying that's just bush or it needs clearing, me and you are not going to get along very well. This is a plant community which has survived all kinds of things. It has all kinds of animals integrated with it. You know, you cannot replace that by something better. Like that, further along there by Bathsheba. So that little part may look very nice, but all those plants practically are exotic plants. You could have actually done something if you wanted something a bit more organized. You could have propagated some of those native plants and done something very attractive there with them, rather than just improving the environment as people claim, because that was just bush, and now we have created a garden with somebody else's bush. As I said, plants are part of our culture. So here's this guy who makes baskets, or so picture taken a while ago, not sure he's still around. But this is a tree found on the edges of gullies called rock balsam, Clusia plucanetii. And it has these hanging roots that come down. And you would, as you see what he's doing, you scrape the kind of bark off the roots. And then I think you split them, and then you're going to plait them. And you get some really nice top of the line baskets from that. So when we live closer to nature, you will be buying that. Now you're just going to go and buy something plastic, a lot cheaper, not going to last very long. And really, you know, there are other examples of that I could give you. Things like swizzle sticks for mixing drinks. Things like when we used to sell the sea grape, what do you call them? Sea eggs in a sea grape cone and so forth. The sea grape leaf cone. Anyway, let's not linger on that. So the problem is that exotic plants are often not well adapted. They're high maintenance. You know, they want their fertilizer, they want their pesticide, because they're having to deal with some insects they never met before, where they were before, and so forth and so forth. They may not support the local fauna. They might outcompete the natives. They may be the opposite now. They might be so attractive that these stupid bees and whatever are all now going to them and not pollinating our plants, even our crop plants. They may look out of place. They may look strange. What is that plant doing here? You may like it, but it's not part of this Caribbean look. And most important of all, they can become invasive. So why do plants become invasive? Because they outcompete the natives. They may grow very fast. They may reproduce very fast. They may disperse their fruit much better. They may be actually toxic to the native plants around them. And lastly, they're often tolerant of a wide range of ecological conditions. So in other words, rather than only living on the beach, can't only survive on the beach, they can survive on the beach, the scrub further back, they can even survive maybe, you know, in the coastal forests, that kind of range that a lot of natives might not have. So to show you the problem we had, this is a study I was involved with back in 2002, 20 odd years ago, where the entire gully network was surveyed. And what you can see here is basically there were some serious invasions. So this is the percentage of segments of a gully that had invasives. So just look at the purple one. So at the bottom, sweet lime, the sweet lime heads, the birds carry that fruit and spread it. So 15.5% of gully segments had sweet lime in it. This plant, which used to be called Sansevieria hyacinthoides, now called Dracaena by the law's tongue, was not far behind at 13%. And the MacArthur palm, which again is from the Philippines, that seemed to be displacing our native macaw palm. So these are the kind of problems you have when you bring in exotics and they actually become invasives. So that is a gully with some sansevieria. So the normal shrubs and herbs that would be in that layer are now gone. And if anybody knows sansevieria, it has these rhizomes, orange rhizomes that spread everywhere. And you will literally have to dig that all up and remove every little piece if you will ever get rid of that plant. So this is one plant I don't think anybody should be selling in a nursery. I know some of the succulent people get upset with me. This is a plant that should only be in a pot. It should never be put in the ground. Now here we are. Anybody know where we are? Anybody awake?
East
We're on the
Coast.
top of Chalky Mountain. Yes. And look what's on the top of Chalky Mountain. Lots of casuarina. Now, casuarina is invasive other places, but I would not say it's really invasive on the coral side of the island. But on this side, the Scotland district, it does seem to like out there. And we've got to be careful because that kind of, substratum of Chalky Mountain, that clay is very brittle and sandstones. And those roots can easily go in there and damage that. And if you don't be careful, there'll be no Chalky Mountain in a few years' time by the time the roots of the casuarinas have finished with it. Well, you may be skeptical about this native species thing. Let's go to South Africa. I went there at a conference many years ago to Cape Town, to the Kirstenbosch National Botanic Gardens. And all the plants in that botanic garden are South African. You will not find any exotic plant. Now, let's be careful because South Africa has a fantastic range of species of fantastic flora. At that conference, somebody said, you've heard of Table Mountain, which is in Cape Town, which is not, it's big, but not that huge. Somebody said there are more species on Table Mountain than there are in the British Isles, okay? But we have a lot of species in the Caribbean too, so we could do something like this if we wanted and make gardens, maybe not just Barbados native, so it would not be enough out of interest, but we could make a Caribbean native garden very easily. There are enough interesting plants to do that. So that's the point I want to make now. I'm not saying that we are only going to be interested in plants that are native to Barbados and never got here. Sorry, we're not brought here from, say, another Caribbean island or even our region, tropical America. So the whole of South America, Central America, the tropical regions, as well as us in the Caribbean, we are part of tropical America, the tropical regions of the Americas. So I would say this, a native plant of tropical America would be better adapted to us, probably, assuming we're talking about a similar habitat, not a rainforest or something, than say a native of Asia or Africa or India or some other exotic species. So, obviously the Caribbean natives are more important, but we're talking really about plants which are native to our region, be it just the Caribbean or even further afield, because some of the examples I show you do come from a little bit further on. All right, so we're going to run through quickly now some examples of plants, native plants, that we use or could use. So here is the seaside yam. That would, it was probably on that beach at Coral Bay at one point. And I like this quote from 1750. This is a long time ago from the Reverend Griffith Hughes. And I just will indulge me once while I read it. It says, it grows chiefly upon the sand. Its continued verdure is very agreeable and covers it, and by so doing prevents the reflection of the sun from the hot sand, which would otherwise be very prejudicial to the eyes of those travelers whose business requires them to use such roads. Well, I never thought of that being a reason to have seaside yam growing, but yeah, I could see that compared to just sand dazzling your eyes, but certainly it holds the sand. It protects the coast. So if you're a hotel, this is something you should be definitely encouraging and planting. Right, what I'm going to do, I think I will actually show the name later because for some of you who know plants, it will be a good exercise to see if you can recognize the plant before I show the name. All right, so this is called yellow mandevilla. Mandevilla is a pink flowered plant related to this Pentylinum luteum. This is actually a wild plant in the other parts of the Caribbean. It's not wild in Barbados. It was brought here as a horticultural plant, but I've seen it growing wild in Anguilla and St. Eustatius, often around swampy areas. But it's a nice, quite attractive plant. It's a garden plant. I mean, the fact it's actually native to the Caribbean might come as a surprise to you. This is another one. This is in the morning glory family, Ipomea horsefoliae, supposedly originally from Jamaica, although some people claim it comes from French Guiana. I'll go with the Jamaica one for the moment. Jeff and I were looking for this for a while because we had it growing on the campus. It used to be a common plant in Barbadian gardens. It is now no longer cultivated commonly in gardens. We found it at Andromeda. It's very difficult to propagate, but it can be propagated. And it's a kind of woody climber with very attractive flowers. Now, this one is totally wild, and I'm not suggesting you would plant this unless you have a very big property, but this is a liana, a woody vine that grows up in the tops of trees. It's called Easter vine because it flowers at Easter time and produces these really attractive lilac, pink, depending on, which one you're coming across, version of the flower. Now, obviously, it's not going to be pretty in any other time but April, May, but the point is we do have attractive plants that they're growing well. And if you had enough space, this is one maybe you could make space for. So I moved to herbs, and botanically, a herb is not the herb as in cooking herbs. Herb, it just means a non-woody plant. So something small that's not woody. So again, going back to near the sea, this one, seaside samphire, Sesusium portunicastrum, is often seen on sea rocks, on the cliffs. So again, if you were trying to do a little landscaping by your house on the St. Philip cliffs, it may be something to think about. It wouldn't require any watering, fertilizing, or anything of the sort. Now, this is another one. This one actually, Bacopa monieri, water hyssop. This actually grows by the edges of ponds and swamps. And I've actually seen this being sold commercially at a nursery. So some plants are being some native plants are actually being sold in nurseries, but I agree, very few and far between. Everybody recognizes this. So this is the whole kind of bottom that was full of this plant. It has various names. I don't know what you might call it. Some people call it crocus. Some people call it gutter lilies, rain lilies.
Really?
But this one is in the onion family, and basically it only flowers. It flowers like a week after heavy rain. So the bulb has to become like waterlogged, anaerobic, and then that induces the flower to develop and come up. There's no reason why that could not be planted and used horticulturally. This is another one, another Zephyranthus, this time Zephyranthus portricensis. And this one tends to be less common. This is usually more up in the wetter parts of the island. You will see it in kind of roadside gutters. Now, this one needs no introduction, I would hope. This is, of course, the spider lily. Now, there are several species of this, some native, and unfortunately what's happened too is that some have been brought in from Florida, which are not native. But anyway, even Florida is a Caribbean native as far as I'm concerned. But this is a plant that grows quite well, is attractive, and again, low input. Now we're moving on to something I know that Jeff is fond of. Jeff works on heliconias. Now, heliconias are not native to Barbados. But if you go to other islands of the Caribbean, Dominica, St. Lucia, whatever, St. Vincent, and go into any kind of forested area, you don't even have to go that high up. And in fact, heliconias grow here quite well in shady, damp places. This one is called Heliconia Bahai or Balazier. And this is all the heliconias in the Caribbean are hummingbird pollinated.
Pollinated.
So, yeah, I'm correct?
Yes.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yes.
And here's another one. And you see these at St. Flower Forest or at Welshmore Gully. This is the one that's known as Caribbean. It's a tall plant in Guadalupe here by a river. And here somebody has, cut a bit, cut this for scale, but various colors, whatever. Big plant. So it's not going to grow in a hot, dry place. But if you live somewhere which is wet and you have a shady corner of your garden, this would be something you could plant, and you have nice cut flowers as well to boot. Here is a bromeliad, something in the pineapple family, which is a lesser Antillean endemic. And this one is actually cultivated. I have it in my garden, and you see it in several other gardens as well. The maidenhair fern, well, we would tend to more have that in a pot, but this is a native plant as well. So the ferns, although I'm really not going to talk much about them, I'm really talking about flowering plants. There's a lot of scope with ferns if you have nice shady areas. And if you don't, then they can become like a house plant in a pot. An example of that is this anthurium. Now, this anthurium is endemic to Barbados and Tobago. It's found nowhere else in the world, okay? Anthurium wilderneyi, the name I heard Hispanically call it by was polycrosia. Now, it's not the most attractive anthurium inflorescence. So I don't know if you can see the bloom. That's one there. There is a kind of green spathe and the kind of spadix. And this one has actually produced berries now. All along there we have fruit. And here you see somebody's growing it in a pot in their veranda. And again, okay, the blooms are not your bright red or whatever anthurium that you might be more familiar with, but it's also an attractive plant and has its place. This one, again, finds its way in terms of cultivation often as a pot plant. It's a peperomia. There are lots of peperomias in the Caribbean, and some of them are, commercially sold. When we cultivate it, we call it money plant. All right, that's what I've heard it called by. And then rock balsam is another name for it, but not to be confused with a rock balsam tree. It has a fleshy leaf, and it has these kind of spikes of flowers, tiny little flowers. And one of the early writers kind of likened these to a rat's tail. So you need to keep your eyes open. So opposite my house, there's a bit of government land, which is kind of grass. And I tend to cut it. I don't know why, but just because it's unsightly. But I had this idea, why not try planting something there that I wouldn't have to cut? So this is a coastal plant, Phyllis strigonosa, a ground cover with little white flowers. And I haven't been too successful, but the point is, these are the kind of things you can do. I'm not saying go digging up a whole set of a plant, but you can take some cuttings, try propagating them, and then see, is this something now is going to cover this area, and I will no longer have to go there with a lawnmower or whatever and cut that area. Another example of nature doing its job. So I have some paving stones, and then this little plant suddenly appeared. Now you may not think it's that attractive, but it's in a convolvulaceae. It's a kind of morning glory, and the flowers are not bad. They only open in the morning, obviously. I have not planted it, and it's spread several parts of my garden, and I'm leaving it because it's a native plant, and it will grow in shade. Not many things will flower in shade and cover the ground and doesn't need watering. Say no more. All right, let's move to shrubs. So the cacti, Jeff is a cactus person. I'm not suggesting the pipe organ cactus, which actually is, I wouldn't say less Antillean endemic because it's also in the Virgin Islands, but it's an Eastern Caribbean endemic. That can get very big, as we saw in that example of the bit that was cut down. And then this other one called flat hand dildo might be this kind of thing to plant as a kind of hedge if you have all kind of animals straying onto some part of your property and you would like to dissuade them from doing so. Right, here's another shrub. Now this tends to grow down by the sea, but it will also be even in dry woodland and coastal woodland as an understory. This is known as monkey spoon or herringbone. And these things that look like leaves are actually flattened stems with little flowers and later fruit along the edge. This is a Caribbean plant. And I have this growing in my garden and it's spreading like crazy. So maybe I have to give away some of the plants. So going back to that bit down by St. John, this is a plant that was growing there. This is what is known as the slipper plant by some people. Euphorbia tithymaloides. The gardeners among you may know it as the old name Pedalanthus tithymaloides. Now it turns out that there are 7 subspecies of this. And this one that you see here that we have growing wild is found only in the Lesser Antilles and Curacao. But there are then 6 other subspecies which are quite different. And then some of these have actually now entered into horticulture. I'm not saying these are well variegated ones. I'm sure these were some odd sport that somebody spotted and then propagated, and then these became now, you know, a garden plant, right? So keep your eyes open for anything odd, because you may be able to then convert something like that into something like that when you find some bit that's doing something strange. West Indian holly. If you are familiar with the Barbados cherry flower, you will recognize this flower as very much like the Barbados cherry flower because it's same genus Malpighia. This does not grow here wild. This is a garden plant, although I don't see it much now. But if you go to the Grenadines, you'll see this all along the coast in the coastal woodland growing in semi-shade. So this is a good Caribbean plant that needs to get back into cultivation on the island. Now, Patria comes from further afield. It's not just the Caribbean, it's also South America. And that picture shows it in St. Lucia, and then on the right, a cultivated one, where obviously people select ones that have much more flowers, different colors, white versus that pale lilac or deep purple, and so forth and so forth. What's happened? Recognize that? That's fat port. So you may not want fat port. Fat port tends to grow better too on the Scotland district. I'm not sure how well it grows on coralline soils. It's survival food in my view. It's not something to eat. And then we have now this kind of red leafed version I saw along the boardwalk at one point, which is a Florida selection of that to make it more attractive. And just a word of marketing. One day I was down the East Coast with some students from McGill, and a guy was selling fat porks, but he didn't call them fat porks. He said, "You want to buy some cocoa plums?" So cocoa plum is a more attractive international name for fat pork. And sometimes maybe you have to change the name of the common name of a plant to make it more palatable. Sea grape, here we are at Sheraton in that hedge. And here somebody has done something a bit more fancy, almost like a little bonsai with that sea grape as well on in their garden. Okay, I am on the south coast. That's the forestation, and that hedge may not look the most fantastic hedge, but that is a hedge based on bread and cheese, the plant you see at the right. And when you trim it, it's very hard to get through it because it's prickly. It doesn't need any care in terms of fertilizer, water, whatever. And if we go along the west coast, where people are still living in their houses as against hotels, you see some interesting uses of native plants. So this one here, it may be hard to see it, but it's this plant, wild coffee. Some people call it privet. I don't know if you have another name for it. It used to be called clerodendron, but the scientists have now said it's Volcameria aculeata. It doesn't matter what scientific name. But this plant makes a good hedge, and as you trim it, the leaves get smaller, which I think is how you get that privet name, because privet is a temperate hedge plant. That's my house again, minus that tree that fell, wall repaired. So some years ago, like a whole lot of people went and planted the Ficus westland, which was decimated by insects. Had to dig it all up. So then I was down Palm Beach, and I saw somebody had a hedge of that same coffee fence. So I took cuttings, rooted them, and there you go. I have now a nice hedge that is pretty impenetrable and doesn't need any care. This one is one you don't see too often, Barbados olive, Bontia daphnoides. I'm not going to read this one, but basically what Hughes is saying in 1750 is you would plant it basically as a windbreak for fields of corn and cotton to stop the salt spray blast. Right, golden dewdrop, I think it's called pigeonberry as well. And now there's several horticultural selections of that with different color leaves, different color flowers. This is native in the Caribbean, but also down to South America. So this is more widespread, more like a tropical American native. But this is a garden plant. You know, you can buy it at a nursery, and it's actually a native in terms of our region. Another one is this one, Rondellecia from Cuba. Very attractive plant. So again, not native, not wild in Barbados, but if you went to Cuba, you would find this growing as a wild plant. Another one from that part of the Caribbean is Portlandia from Jamaica. A big hedge, small tree with beautiful white flowers from Portlandia. And again from Cuba, Jatropha. And all of you who have seen this plant know that it's quite resilient. You don't have to really care for this plant. You can have a hedge of it in the driest part of the island, and it will look quite respectable. Jatropha integrorhynma. Okay, so we're moving on to trees. Keep an eye on the clock because, you know, I know we don't want to run over. I want to give you time for questions. So here is Christmas Hope, Tacoma stands. You see this growing wild. This actually is probably a selection because it has more flowers than the typical one we see wild. But again, a good small tree. This one is not common. This is a wild plant. I was involved with designing some trees of Barbados stamps some years back. And this is a plant you see down by Pico Tenerife and some other areas, not very many of them. Quite attractive when it's in flower, as you can see from that stamp. This is another Jamaican plant, Jamaica ebony, Brea ebonis. It's triggered by rain, the flowering. Again, an attractive plant from the Caribbean. Now we have frangipanis too, and the frangipanis are all about, you know, tropical American, not just from the Caribbean. But this particular one is wild in Eastern Caribbean, not Barbados. You'll find it in cultivation in Barbados, but this is taken in Bequia, and you'll see it all along the coast with its white flowers and its narrow leaves. This is a plant from Barbados, Jacquinia arborea, a small tree, shrub. We have it planted at university, and it can be quite attractive with its orange berries. The white flowers aren't that striking, maybe in that close up they are. And here's another standard. Now this one is cultivated. This is the black willow. It used to be called Capparis cynophalophora. It's now called Quadrella cynophalophora. I wouldn't tell you what cynophalophora means, but it's to do with a dog. Okay, and here it is by a friend of mine, his house. He planted 3 of them. They're very slow growing. That's their main, I guess, drawback. But they're very attractive trees with their dark, shiny foliage. The only drawback is at certain times of the year, they seem to get infested by the diamondback moth. Is it a moth? Yeah. Cabbage white, that kind of thing. Some kind of flying insect.
It was wait.
Right, this one is much used in Florida. We haven't decided to start using it in Barbados horticulturally, but this is birch gum, Bursera cimaruba. It's in the frankincense family, and it has a kind of resin which is quite aromatic. So this is the one that has that peeling bark. You saw a picture of it in the Cayman Islands, and some people are now calling it tourist tree because of the peeling skin. Whitewood, again, this used to be a commonly cultivated tree, not so much now. There used to be a big one down by the Fairchild Street Market. I'm not sure, the Cheapside Market. Not sure if it's still there. Lignum vitae, strong and mighty, is a Caribbean plant. In Barbados, it was just surviving to me as a cultivated tree because it's very slow growing, very attractive. But in fact, some of my colleagues in the Ministry of Environment who have been doing a gully survey have actually started to find it in gullies. So it is actually, you know, out there surviving as a Caribbean plant without being cultivated. but worth growing if you have the patience and you're young enough that you may actually see it as a nice big mature tree. Mahogany. Now, mahogany is really originally from the Northern Caribbean. It was, I think, introduced here in the late 1700s.
50. 1750.
Whatever, can't remember off the top of my head. But this is really native to like Florida, Jamaica, Cuba, and Hispaniola. That is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And in fact, the use of mahogany in furniture for Europeans started in Dominican Republic, in the capital, where the cathedral there was built in the 1500s, and they used mahogany throughout. They obviously learned from the indigenous people what a good wood it was, and then of course the rest is story. So when people talk about Barbados mahogany, there's really no such thing in terms of the tree originating here. But what they mean is mahogany grown in Barbados. The wood grown in Barbados is actually quite good for furniture. I think that may have a spelling mistake in the scientific name, but anyway. Right, you recognize that, the cabbage palm. Again, for the average person, we're not going to plant that in our yard. But it's a very attractive tree, arborescent plant, whatever you want to call it. I would say it's very regal. But technically speaking, the common name for this one is a cabbage palm. But I would say I wouldn't get upset if you called it a royal palm, because that's a royal palm in Cuba, outside a hotel, to the right. And I don't think that looks as royal as our cabbage palm. Whoops, right? Now, if you drive along the highway, somebody has brought in these royal palms. So you'll see some royal palms as well as some cabbage palms. And there's always a danger in that when you bring in things which are related, that they may hybridize. And we've seen that with the mahogany, the broadleaf mahogany from Honduras, Honduras mahogany, and the West Indian mahogany. Right, this palm, I kept finding it in gullies, this thatch palm, but not that size, just a small plant. And then worked out it's the same as this thing that is in people's front yards. Coccothrynax barbadensis. Now, this was mentioned by Ligon in 1650 as used for thatching roofs growing along the coast. Now, in the fact, this picture is the one from the Cayman Islands. It's a different species of Coccothrynax. So each island, well, the Eastern Caribbean have this one, barbadensis. Don't mind barbadensis. It's not just Barbados. And in the Cayman Islands, I saw a display where they were using it for thatching, showing how it had been used in the past. And then that's the other use. Now, young people probably will not know what that really is. It's some kind of cobwebbing broom or whatever. And we used to import them from Dominica and St. Lucia, made from this palm. I don't know if it's still brought in here. I've seen somebody walking around looking with something looking like that. But this palm is not very common in Barbados now, but it deserves to be cultivated. Down the East Coast, we have mayho. This is actually a hibiscus genus. And if you look at the flower, you can see that it's related to hibiscus. And this is of a broader distribution. This is a tropical American species, but it's actually native here. You find it down Bath, down Castle Wash Way. And it used to be quite commonly cultivated as a tree and often trimmed into kind of umbrella canopy, a nice shade tree. I don't see that so much now. But what I have seen is this variegated form of it. I don't know where that came from, but there is happily growing on a South Coast beach. And why not? All right, so this one is another mayho. A mayho really is a Amerindian name for a plant from which you can make rope or some kind of string for the bark. So this one is actually pantropical. All tropical shorelines around the world have it. So it's native not just here, but everywhere in the tropics. And this is on that same beach. So, you know, this is doing a good job here. Its roots have got exposed by that last storm surge, but this is just by the Police Boys Club by the Esplanade. And it's a nice, attractive tree. There's a whole bunch of them as well near the harbor, what used to be called Trevor's Way. Yes. All right, lastly, you know, just to show you a little bit that I do practice a little bit of what I preach. So here's a pond of my house probably many years ago. This is a native plant, seaside sage, and I got some plants common in wetlands as well growing in the pond. So this white water lily is the only native water lily that you see in Barbados. All those purple ones and all of that, they're being brought in here. But this is actually native to our part of the world. And this sedge with those triangular cross-section leaves is, people call it a rush, a bulrush. And they actually use it to rush chairs with. You take 3 of them together, you kind of twist it, and you can make the seats of chairs with that. And here's that, the other plant I was showing you there, the seaside sage. It doesn't need to be by the sea. It doesn't need the salt. It's doing all right in my garden. And it's an attractive plant. I don't have any warts, but apparently the sap can burn off warts if you so desire. And then lastly, you can mix and match. So here I have some gibberas, these plants here, they're from South Africa originally. And this is another Zephyranthus, a pink one, not like the yellow and the white. This one comes from Colombia. So it's tropical American, but it's not Caribbean. But the grass, that grass is actually a native grass. That's savanna grass. Now, having said that, savanna does need a bit of water and so forth. But having said that, if you want to plant a lawn with a grass that's native, that's a good example. And to finish up, here we are at the UE, where we planted a kind of area like a gully where the students could relax, and planted an area like the scrub along the East Coast with the agave and the seaside sage and various things. So you can do something attractive, imitating what nature is doing. Whether you like it or not would be another story. And then we also have more species which have obvious appeal. These are from the tops of mountains. You wouldn't find them here. The one on the left is from St. Lucia, unique to St. Lucia. But you can imagine the horticultural people could get into that. And then you have all kind of problems. So let me just make it quite clear now. I'm not suggesting you go there with a shovel and start digging up plants, right? If you like something you see and you can't get it in a nursery, take some cuttings, collect some seeds, try hatching them, but do not go digging up things from the wild, because that is not what I'm talking about. Ideally, we will have nurseries that will sell local native plants. I know NCC is moving in that direction. I hope so. And others, as I said, Landmark was selling that, a hyssop plant that I showed you earlier. The other problem when people come in here and take up plants, next thing you know, they're making money out of them without us getting the benefit. There's no benefit sharing. Now, it's some plant, they do some breeding on it, and before you know it, you're buying it from them. And the other problem with kind of taking things from nature is the hybridization problem, like bringing things which are normally separated geographically, they're now together, and now you can get hybrids, which might not be a bad thing, unless the hybrid now replaces the 2 species and you don't have the 2 species anymore. So I don't know, how do we promote native plants? Well, the first thing I would say is protected areas. I'm glad to hear that something is happening with Tyrosol wood. We need some gullies being protected, and we need probably some beaches being protected. The sand dune area down Belle Plaine needs protecting, all of those areas. And then we need public awareness of what our native plants are, because people don't know what's native. And I'm to blame for that too, because I'm a botanist, and yet I have not produced some lists that anybody could look at. I've given a talk now, so you have a better idea. But the nurseries now need to come on stream. And then we need people interested, like how we have a cactus group or whatever, orchid group. We need some kind of native plant group of people who are interested in these kind of plants and using them. And then we need research in how we garden with them. And basically, we need also, as I said, nurseries to sell these plants. Because I'm not in any way suggesting that you go out there and take up plants from the wild. And even policy. So again, the policy would be that you can't go to a beach and go dig up a plant. No. The same way you can't go to the beach and dig up sand. So that's my book. It's been out of print for a little bit because they ran out. So it's being reprinted with a few corrections. And in fact, today I got a call saying it's in the port. So if you were trying to get it and you weren't able to get it, probably in a week or two, it will be back on the shelves. So to end on a positive note, this is not a macaw palm, all right? This is something called a gru-gru palm, Acrocomia aculeata. It's a tropical American species, and it was supposedly here. We have a Flora Barbados from 18 something that mentioned it, but there's no specimens ever I've seen from Barbados. And I only recently saw one in a very isolated place in the Scotland district. But this group of young people, some of them are former students, if not all of them, I think, of course, former students of mine who work for the Ministry of Environment, are currently doing a gully survey. And they've come across a lovely little grove of these in a high rainfall gully, doing very well. So, all is not lost. Things are not just disappearing. We're actually finding things we didn't even know we had. Now, that's not something you want to collide with. But I just wanted to end on this note because I think, we have people out there now with the interest, with the knowledge to identify some of these plants. I joined them, just to confirm it really was that, and it was that. So I'm really pleased about that, and I felt I wanted to finish by sharing that find with you. So it's not a macaw palm, it's not the Iphanes minima. It may look like it with sprinkles, but it's a huge big palm by comparison, and the leaves are different, and the fruit are like the size of a table tennis ball. Hard, not like a little berry like the macaw palm. All right, so on that note, I will wrap up, finish, and let you ask your questions. Turn over to my moderator and let him say what he wants to say.
Yes. Thank you, Sean, for a lovely lecture. Lots of food for thought. One of the things I don't want to say bothering me, but on the point of zoning in actually utilizing these plants in landscaping, you have the majority of persons who are looking for showy plants, which comes under exotics. How would you try to steer them in a direction where they're using more local plants?
Well, I think you can mix and match. I mean, you can have a kind of, even in a bed where this plant you're talking about is this showy exotic thing, cancerous with color and all that. You could have that amid a planting which is, less, obviously, native plants which might be less attractive. Maybe you will be having your irrigation going to that in particular, but everything else around. Or you may just have a very discrete part of your garden where your holy of holies, where these very demanding plants will be pampered and looked after. Yeah, I'm not going to change people. A lot of people would just, even at the end of this, say, he's just talking about bush. I don't want bush in my garden. But I think not all of us look at life that way. And for those who can see the beauty in these kind of plants, there's hope.
Okay.
I see some questions and answers. Okay. Where is the book sold? Right. Well, there aren't many bookshops left in Barbados, but it was sold at the museum. It was sold at the George Washington house. They actually had a copy still up to a week ago of the old one. It was sold in Cape Shepherd, I think, Best of Barbados. And also it was sold at Percy's Carter's in Wildy, which is more of a stationery shop, but they were selling it as well. I see Karen is asking about highlighting native planting in horticulture courses. And I just want to say that I'm no longer really lecturing at UE, but I do think, yes, that the course I ran called Plants for Caribbean Landscapes, which Jeff was very much a part of, that included this element in the course. But I think there is scope, yeah. But I think we need some people. I am not a real gardener. I think you need somebody who likes this kind of thing, and then can now show to the best what I could not do with my own efforts at gardening. Yeah, well, I do, as I said, Landmark Nurseries sold that kind of, semi-aquatic wetland one, that little ground cover. So there's obviously demand for it. But I do think you can get also things like the black willow is sold commercially. And some other things, the wider ones like the pentas, obviously is like a garden plant, or the Durante erecta, what's that called? Golden dewdrop or pigeonberry.
You're gonna right.
So yeah, there are some things, the ones which have already got into the gardening world already, you can find them. But other ones you will really have to, at the moment, by very careful and judicious, cuttings, you will have to then try to propagate yourself, I think.
Yeah, the Ministry of Agriculture at Haggett's would also have some like sea grate fat pork. Yeah, as well.
Yeah. So do we have any serious gardeners in the in the audience? But I think it's really important. As I see Karen has just come back on again saying landscaping companies on board. I think yes. And I think for like big projects like hotels, I mean, that's what I would say with Jeff's comment. Much of the landscaping of the hotel should be with resilient native plants. And then you might have some areas, say in the lobby where you might have some heliconias, I don't know what, the more anthuriums and God knows what, the exotic ones anyway. But I think there's scope for big projects to try to take on board native species rather than just, the simple things you just buy out of Miami or out of a local nursery.
Yeah. You mentioned the Pride of India topping in your garden, falling over. What I realized with a lot of the Pride of Indias, they usually top them, so they become top heavy. So the maintenance of a number of the plants, I think we need to look at as well.
Right. I just saw some other bits on the chat which I wasn't seeing before. The UE bookshop had the book. I know I should have mentioned them. But I know they didn't have it the other day when I wanted. So, but they will have it once it's back. The Yellow Manivella, yeah, they would both be at nurseries. And Duranta and the Pentas. Finding hard with monkeys and a herd of wild goats that roam my neighborhood. Yeah, well, I had cows at one time because I'm in Fine Gardens. And I had to eventually put gates on because in the dry season, that pond, they say that the cows can smell water. I don't know if that's really true, but it certainly would end up in my garden and be tramping around and drinking water from the pond. So I had to eventually put gates on. But I guess what you can do is to plant some kind of prickly hedge around your property. Like the same wild coffee that I have at my front of my house is another option. I see somebody has another message. I specialize in exotics, orchids, and aroids, so I'm interested in the anthurium you spoke of. It's impossible to specialize in natives with so many barriers to access. Yeah, well, we have to start though. I think we have to get some nursery, and I think Landmark might be interested because I've seen things there already. Can you tell me about the Jack-in-the-Box tree? Right. So the Jack-in-the-Box tree there's only one that I know of left anymore. It's in Turnasol Wood. The early part, like up from the bridge where the old bridge was. There used to be several up in there, and I still feel there are more, but I haven't really, like being with other people looking for it, we couldn't actually find more. But one we do find is a mature one. So it's a huge big tree. It has this kind of hollow yellow fruit with a black seed in the center. And it got its name because when the wind blew, you would get this kind of noise. So sonora, the name is Hernandez sonora. So it's like sonorous. It whistles. If you haven't got my book, hang on. I'm trying to find the page. I don't know if you can, probably not. Yeah, anyway, there's a picture of the fruit. And what's distinctive about it, it has this heart-shaped leaf. Well, the only other heart-shaped leaf common in the wild is a sandbox. But this heart-shaped leaf has a pink dot on it. So, especially the young seedlings. And there used to be seedlings in there. So I'm hoping that this one tree will still be able to produce fruit. Hope it doesn't need to have, I hope it doesn't have self-incompatibility, because some trees or plants will not accept pollen from themselves. So I'm hoping I will see fruit on it, and maybe we'll see some seedlings. But just one other point about the Jack-in-the-Box. Apparently, it was common in gullies before. And I even saw some report from the 1800s which claimed that Jack-in-the-Box gully was called because of Jack-in-the-Box trees. But there's certainly no Jack-in-the-Box trees there now. But it's not unique to Barbados. It's actually throughout the Caribbean and even into South America. So if you Google it under the scientific name Hernandez sonora, let me just reply to that to give you a name. How do I do that? Right. Hernandez sonora. If you Google that, you'll find more pictures of it. All right.
Prof,
So, yeah.
Just one more. Since we're on that point about not finding Jack-in-the-Box and Jack-in-the-Box, how do you feel about reintroduction of some of these species that we can no longer find in the wild?
Yeah, I am not necessarily against it. I mean, I'm not, I'm against is somebody getting them, planting them, and then claiming they discovered them growing wild, a couple of years later. But I think if it's documented that we brought this thing in, I mean, a good case in point, you will remember the mastic. So mastic, a complicated story because it's a tree, a timber tree that went extinct, and it was considered a Barbados species. But it turns out that our mastic is really just a Caribbean-wide species. The name has changed. So it's no longer a unique Barbadian plant, and it's found in other islands. And the National Trust actually brought in, some seeds and reintroduced it on some properties. But I also found one growing wild in a gully in St. Peter, which you remember that. And before all that introduction. So some plants can survive when we think they've gone. That's the truth. So I'm not against interruption.
Yes.
I see some more comments. Let me just see here. Jason Miller. Low maintenance that can be convinced of current ground cover alternatives of grass to reduce mowing. Yeah, so that plant I showed you that it was in my case, if you have my book, it's Phyla strigulosa. And you'll find it growing like down Bathsheba along the back from the sea, from the beach. And you could easily take a piece. But there are other things as well, like I think that is native or certainly tropical American. What used to be called Wedelia, sphagneticula, in the daisy family. Woodelius, yeah, Sphagnificola trilobata. It's a ground cover with yellow daisy-like flowers. And that doesn't need any water. That doesn't need to be by the sea. So, you know, there's some options like that. I think you have to look around. As I said, don't go digging up things, but there's nothing wrong with taking, yeah. So Tennyson talks about Portulaca. Well, the Portulaca grandiflora, though, I can't remember where that's from, but that's not a native. But there are like two wild Portulacas, which are not as attractive, but they are options too. It's kind of difficult for me to suddenly produce pictures. Yeah, I have pictures on my computer, but it would be hard to kind of do that. So is that it? Any other questions? Any other comments? If not, over to you, Jeff.
I was just checking my scribbles in the lecture.
But I think NCC are talking about developing a nursery with some native plants. I think more for their own use to try with the beach vegetation issue. So I want to share something because I was at a conference in Dominican Republic called Puentes Botanicos, Botanical Bridges. And there was a guy from Florida presented there. And he spoke about a very long stretch of beach near Naples in Florida, where we'd had basically, you know, terrible storm surges and had taken away large tracts of beach. And tourism is very important up there, so no problem. They spent 20 million US dollars and brought in sand. Well, guess what happened? The sand got washed back out. So this guy from the Botanic Garden there, he has been working now on a system for, you know, revegetating beaches. And he reckons now he could probably, you know, he can do that for half the price, you know, because it's a big area. We're not just talking about your Phantom Hotel. We're talking about long miles and miles of beach. But he's developed, you know, protocols for, you know, propagating, got a nursery to actually start propagating these plants commercially, and then ways to kind of stick them in the ground in a way that we get a good start. So I think those nature-based solutions are important. And, you know, especially where we are losing coastline, it's worth experimenting with that, trying, but you need the plants. So I think NCC's experiment where they're going to try now developing in their nursery, you know, some propagation of coastal plants for sure. But I think trees as well, from gullies and stuff, is an important development. Anyway, I'm impressed that so many of you attended because, you know, I think people have better things to do on a night. And in case you didn't know, we had what, 38 people or something like that in attendance. So maybe we need to organize something in the flesh where we can actually go and kind of look somewhere when people have their books, not like trying to sell books, but, you know, when you have your book, there we go, and you're trying to get some experience, maybe we'll have some kind of free gathering somewhere suitable. When there's a bit more rain and a bit more plants around, yeah.
Yeah, I'll hold you to it. The Horticultural Society can host you at some point in time in the future. And that should be a good experience.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I don't think I have anybody else need to answer. Where did Vinca come from? Vinca comes from Madagascar. But it's actually quite naturalized here. If you go down Belle Plaine, you will see a lot of Vinca. Well, not Vinca, yeah, Vinca rosier. Yeah, I'm getting rusty on names at the moment, but pretty sure I'm right. Yeah. So things that grow well here in the well don't necessarily come from here. But yeah, you know, I wouldn't have a problem in somebody growing that in a garden if they want some color. I'm not some purist that would say, oh no, you must not grow an exotic plant in your garden or whatever. I'm not saying that at all. All right, so thank you very much. I enjoyed being here.
Thank
And
you,
we'll
Professor
meet up
Carrington.
again. Bye.
Yes. Thanks again.